Morning, everyone. Dr. Myers here. We're going to get back into our nutritional lecture series. And in this part four of our series, we're going to talk about how we can supplement our anaerobic metabolism. So we're going to conduct a quick review like we normally do with our lectures. We're going to review the anaerobic energy pathways, the fuel sources associated with the anaerobic pathways, how carbohydrates are the fuel source for glycolysis, and then we'll get into the main part, meat and potatoes of our lecture here on how we supplement the anaerobic pathways, particularly the two anaerobic pathways of the phosphagen system and the glycolytic system. So let's do a quick review. In our previous lecture, we discussed briefly VO2 max. We defined it and also lactate threshold, right? We said that VO2 max was the maximum oxygen utilization the body can utilize. And the lactate threshold is that imaginary line between where we go between our anaerobic and aerobic pathways. And so everything below lactate threshold is aerobic, and everything above the lactate threshold is anaerobic. And if you go back to lectures 2 and 3, we talked about within the anaerobic processes, we have two metabolic pathways to create adenosine triphosphate or ATP, which is the energy that the body utilizes. The first anaerobic pathway is the glycolytic pathway. And then the second one was the phosphagen pathway. And then those are our two anaerobic processes to create ATP. Everything else is aerobic, which utilizes oxygen to create ATP. Now, when we talk about fuel sources, the aerobic pathway utilizes fats and carbohydrates to produce ATP. It's all intensity dependent. Now, once we get to our lactate threshold, right, which is again that line between the body's primarily creating ATP via aerobic or versus anaerobic pathways. But since everything above threshold is anaerobic, like we just said, carbohydrates are the only fuel source that are utilized by the anaerobic pathway. So whenever a fuel source is utilized via an anaerobic pathway to create adenosine triphosphate, that fuel source will always be carbohydrates. All right. Now, let's dive into that concept a little bit more. Again, carbohydrate, CHO is carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharides, also known as glucose. We find glucose in the bloodstream. That's why it's also called blood sugar. Now, we did say that we have two different anaerobic pathways. We have anaerobic glycolysis, or also known as the glycolytic pathway, and we also have the phosphagen pathway. Anaerobic glycolysis is the only pathway that utilizes carbohydrate as the fuel source, whereas the phosphagen pathway is a single-step reversible reaction, and so it doesn't really have a fuel source. And when we have a fuel source to create ATP, it's an entire biochemical pathway that changes the carbohydrate into the end product of ATP, and that's a several-step pathway through glycolysis. If you want more information on that, go back to the second lecture in the series. Now, that's a quick review on the anaerobic pathways, carbohydrates. And the reason we cover that because it's an important concept to understand what we're going to talk about supplementation of these pathways, which is the meat and potatoes of today's lecture. Before we get into that, let's define two items. The first is, what is an ergogenic aid? An ergogenic aid is any substance, mechanical aid, or training method that improves sports performance. So, for example, running shoes. Having the right running shoes can improve run performance. Recently, we broke the 2-hour mark for marathoning. They used a couple of different ergogenic aids to do this. First, they used the Nike Vapor 4%, which is a carbon fiber plated running shoe that helps with increasing the gait. They also utilize other humans to create a draft for the runner to run in. So that is a training method, also a mechanical aid to improve performance. Now, when we talk about ergogenic aids in reference to this lecture, we're talking about pharmacological aids or supplements. And so let's further define a supplement. It's a product that is intended to supplement the diet, and it's always ingested. So it's not advertised as a typical food or a sole meal or diet product. Just remember that. It's in addition to the foodstuffs that we eat to create energy through the metabolic pathways. Now, this is the first of two important notes that we'll go through in this lecture. And before you take any type of supplement, you should always do the research on it. All right. First, before you start taking supplements, you need to ensure you understand and have and are following the sound principles of training. This includes adequate recovery, hydration, and proper nutrition. So before you consume anything, do your research. The information I'm giving you is the bare basics. When we talk about supplements throughout this lecture series, am I by no means telling you to take the supplement. I'm just trying to provide you some information and avenues to do the research before you start taking any type of supplements. So you can classify supplements into different categories, but they must contain one or more of the following: a vitamin, mineral, herb aids, amino acids, a dietary substance utilized by humans that is taken through regular meal sources, but you need more of it to get a better effect. So for example, protein supplementation. We'll get into that a little bit more. Or metabolites or something else that just helps with it. It's a broad category that contains all this. Now, our second important note, you got to understand the difference between a dietary supplement and a drug. Drugs in the eye of the US government and the FDA are highly regulated. So ibuprofen, Tylenol, any over-the-counter drug or prescription drugs, those are highly regulated, highly studied before they're put on the market. Dietary supplements are not. They're not highly regulated, and this is defined under the law known as the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994. Basically, what this says is when a supplement or an item is classified as a supplement, it is on the producer to make sure that they are following the law. The FDA will not actively go out and test these products. So that's why it's almost called the wild, wild west when we start talking about supplements, because under this law, it is under the producer to make sure that they are following the correct guidelines when creating a supplement. And so this is why you need to make sure you do the research and read the label so you're not taking anything illegal. So let's move into this. So how do we supplement the anaerobic metabolic pathways? Let's talk about the first one, the phosphagen pathway. And again, going back to what we talked about in lecture 1 and reviewed several times in the first 3 lectures, is the phosphagen pathway is the first 10 seconds of energy utilized. And when we look at exercise intensity versus duration. So again, when you're talking about a very high intensity exercise with a very short duration, you're most likely using the phosphagen pathway to create ATP. So for example, sprinting, doing a 50 or 100-yard sprint, you're using the phosphagen pathway. When you're lifting heavy weights for like hypertrophy set, power set, or strength set, you're utilizing the phosphagen pathway to create ATP. And as we said earlier, the phosphagen pathway is a single-step reversible reaction to create ATP. You have phosphocreatine plus the molecule of adenosine diphosphate. Those are combined. The phosphagen is broken off. The inorganic phosphate is broken off the phosphocreatine molecule and added to the adenosine diphosphate to create ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. That's what it is. And so when we're trying to supplement this pathway, we're trying to provide more creatine for free floating phosphates to attach to. And so the thought process is the more phosphocreatine you have available, the more available energy that the the more available fuel that's available for the phosphagen pathway to create ATP. And so if you have more of that fuel, you can extend the phosphagen pathway a little bit more, and you can do more reps within that as well. And that's really what we're saying with this. Now, if you do the supplementation correctly, research has shown that you can increase the creatine content within the muscles upwards to 20%. Now, there is a saturation limit, and this is highly dependent on the athlete's genetic coding, the type of muscles you have. Are you more type 1 versus type 2, X, Y, and Z? But in general, it's roughly about 20%. And so if you do this correctly, we see several benefits. It's increase in muscular strength, increase in muscular size. That's the ones we're typically looking for. But there's others. There's protection for heat. There's brain protection. And the list goes on and on. Creatine has been highly studied since the mid-90s until now, and it's been showing to have benefits across a myriad of different avenues of human performance. So let's get into dosing. So with a lot of our supplements, you'll find that you need to do a loading period in order to get to a therapeutic level to get any type of benefit from the supplement. And creatine is no exception. It is generally accepted and supported by research that you have a loading period of 5 to 7 days, and you need to take roughly about 5 grams per day, which is 0.3 grams per kilogram of your body weight for that time period. Now, after that, you go into a maintenance period, and that maintenance period is generally accepted to be at 3 grams per day. Sorry about that. Had just a little bit of a computer hiccup. Let me make one small little correction here on the slide. Let's go back to the loading. So you need to do 5 grams per day for 5 to 7 days. And this should read roughly 0.8 grams per body weight in kilograms. So 5 grams per day for 5 to 7 days. Now, when we move to maintenance, the dosage is a little bit lower. On average, most people will take 3 grams per day, which is roughly about 0.3 grams per kilogram in body weight per day. Now, you could take upwards to 5 grams for a normal athlete with that, still have the same benefits with no issues. Now, when we start talking about larger individuals, those who are above 90, roughly about 90 to 100 kilograms of weight, you'll definitely have to take more than that. And research has shown that ingestion of 5 to 10 grams per day is necessary, and there's not a lot of side effects to it. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So this is just a little bit of a chart that I want to bring up to one of the, this was one of the articles I used for this lecture. This was produced by Kreider et al., who wrote this group of authors wrote the stance on creatine supplementation for the International Society of Sports Nutritionists. And what we're showing is just with basic creatine loading, you can increase your muscle stores again by that 20%. But a way to get it a little bit higher, a little bit faster, is to utilize creatine while eating regular food as well. That's high in proteins, and you'll find that with your meats and such. And so that's why the creatine is slightly higher with this methodology. Now, long and short-term studies are showing that dosage ranges from 0.3 to 0.8 kilograms per day, grams per kilogram per day, for up to 5 years poses no health risks to both infants, normal, healthy population and elderly folks. And a lot of people, when we start thinking about creatine, they start thinking about renal issues or dysfunction of the kidneys. And we find that this does not occur. So bottom line is, when you take creatine properly over a chronic state up to 5 years, it poses little to no health risks, as evidenced by the research. You can find more information on this with the stance by Kreider et al. At the following link. Now, let's move into the glycolytic pathway. Now, the glycolytic pathway is still anaerobic, but it comes after the phosphagen pathway. So we're talking about high intensity exercise efforts from 15 seconds upwards to 2 minutes. So if you're running a 400 and 800, you're glycolytic, stuff like that, when you're talking about your exercise intensities. So let's talk about beta alanine. And this is a big one that you'll find with those who, CrossFitters, track athletes, and even some cyclists and triathletes. Beta alanine is a non-essential amino acid. And so this amino acid is not utilized to create proteins. It's used for buffering the body's pH. And how it's done this is it's combined with the amino acid histidine to create the molecule of carnosine. And what we'll find is carnosine is found in the muscles, and it's used to buffer and maintain the body's pH. So, and when we talk about pH, why is this important in the human body? Well, this goes back to the glycolytic pathway. The end products of the glycolytic pathway, after that ATP is produced, is the molecule of lactate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions are acid ions. And so when you have an overabundance of acid accumulating in the blood, it causes the body's pH levels to decrease. And so when the body's pH levels gets below 7.0 or greater than 7.2, the body becomes inefficient for creating with its enzymes. And so when your pH is too high or too low, enzymes are denatured, which reduces their efficacy. So the body is always trying to maintain its pH at between 7.0 and 7.2. And so if you're spending too much time in the glycolytic pathway, you're creating more and more acid ions or hydrogen ions, which is dropping the pH, which is reducing the body's ability to create more energy via its metabolic pathways. So the way it gets around this is the working muscles use the molecule of carnosine to help scavenge those hydrogen ions to maintain the pH of 7.2. So let's talk about dosing. Again, like as in creatine, there's a loading period. With beta alanine, you want to take 4 to 6 grams per day. And it's most advisable to divide that dosing to 2 grams or less throughout the entire day. So you can take, if you're taking 4 grams daily, you can take 1 gram 4 times a day, or by somewhere throughout. Now, we'll talk about the importance of this. And the loading period is 2 weeks. Now, moving into a maintenance period, you want to take your doses up to 4 to 6 grams per day. And again, you can take it up to 4 to 10 weeks with no major issues. It is advisable to cycle off of it. Now, we find that high responders versus low responders, the biggest difference is it comes down to muscle fiber composition. Bottom line is, for you, the take-home message with this is keep your dosing about 4 to 6 grams per day. Now, unlike, let me back up here for a second. So the reason that beta alanine is such an important buffer is because we're talking about that glycolytic pathway, that duration period. And so what we find is beta alanine does cross over a little bit into the high aerobic system. So if we were to go back to our chart first thing in our lecture, let's go back here. There we go. So what we're talking about is beta-alanine really helps with buffering at intensities at threshold and in zone 5. It doesn't do anything for zone 6 because it's a completely different pathway with different outcomes. And so that's why we say it can go from anywhere for efforts between 1 to 5 minutes, because these are the energy pathways or intensities that it truly affects. And get back here. And so now you find a reduced effort, reduced efficacy of this compound when it's great, when the efforts are greater than 5 minutes. Now, with beta-alanine, it does have side effects. The main side effect that you see with it is called paresthesia. Basically, it's severe tingling or prickling of the skin, i.e., you're on pins and needles, and it can actually be very painful. You'll typically feel it in your hands and feet. Some people find it in the back of their neck. Others find it in the tips of their ears, which tends to be a lot more painful than in the hands and feet from some of the subjective reports that I've seen. Now, there are strategies to minimize this. The first and most obvious way is to take your beta-alanine with a meal. And so if you do that, it helps absorb it in the food, and the body is not trying to break it down in its pure form. The other way of doing that is taking it in smaller doses. So if you're in that maintenance period of taking it 4 to 6 grams per day, if you take if you break it into 2-gram increments or 2 grams or less increments, it tends to reduce the paresthesia. And also the type of beta-alanine that you're using. So there are several different types of beta-alanine on the market. If you take the slow absorbing kind, that tends to reduce the paresthesia effects, or also taking carnosine, basically the converted form of beta-alanine. You'll find carnosine out on the market. It is a little more expensive than the slow absorption beta-alanine, but it does reduce the effects of paresthesia. And you can find more information here at these 2 article sites. So we covered a lot in this longer than normal lecture. We've discussed the fuel sources for energy production in reference to the anaerobic metabolic pathways. We discussed and defined what ergogenic aids and supplements are. And we discussed the properties, dosages, and side effects of creatine and beta-alanine and how they can help supplement your performance during anaerobic efforts. I know we covered a lot here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I will answer them the best I can. Thank you for your time and take care.